Welcome to A Slice of Medieval. Today's guest is Gemma Holman, who is a historian and author who specialises in late medieval English history. A fellow of the Royal Historical Society, her first book, Royal Witches, was published in 2019, and she is with us now to talk about her second book, The Queen and the Mistress. The Queen and the Mistress looks into the lives of Philippa of Hainault, Queen of Edward III, and Alice Perrers, Edward III's infamous mistress. So welcome, Gemma.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Please tell us a little bit about Philippa of Hainault and Alice Perrers.
Yeah, so they're two quite interesting women, obviously I think so. Philippa of Hainault was a noble woman, basically a royal in sort of medieval Europe. So she was the daughter of the Count and Countess of Hainault. They also had various other territories, Holland and Zealand. So they were quite powerful. So although they were sort of counts, as I said, they kind of act like European royalty. They rule their own territory. So very important people. She's related to various royal families across Europe as well. So she's got royal blood through her veins. So she grows up in a very wealthy household. She gets lots of education, and it's expected that she'll marry into another sort of very powerful family into Europe. And so she's got a very different upbringing to Alice Perrers. So Alice is born quite a few years after Philippa, probably about 30 years later. And she had a completely different start in life. So she was an English woman. And it's very likely that she was born into a family of goldsmiths in London. So she was part of this up-and-coming mercantile class that kind of developed in the 14th century in Europe, that's kind of above peasants but below sort of knights and nobles. And this sort of comes out of the growing economy in England at this time, where people are just getting more money, and so they're having a bit of a better start in life. So in terms of the people in the country as a whole and sort of people coming before her, Alice certainly had a much better upbringing. She likely seems to have been educated to some extent. She seems to have been able to at least read in English. She would have had a fairly comfortable upbringing with a few luxuries available to her. But in terms of the sort of general hierarchy of England, she was still very way down the ladder. As I said, she wasn't titled, she wasn't noble. She was very much just sort of a higher class peasant rather than a lower class noble. So two different backgrounds in life that these two women came from, but both of them ended up at one point or another at the English court and falling in love with the same man, who was King Edward III.
Obviously, Philippa is married to Edward for quite a long time. It's quite a long marriage. He lives to a ripe old age. She dies before him. But where in that timeline does the relationship with Alice begin for Edward? Is that whilst Philippa is still alive, or is that afterwards?
Yeah, so as you say, they were married for a very long time. They got married when they were in their mid-teens. And so they're married for just over 40 years in total, as you say, up until Philippa's death. So they'd had a very long and happy marriage. And as far as we can tell, it was just the two of them, only had eyes for each other. They had many, many children together. But it was actually whilst Philippa was still alive that Alice enters the scene at court. So she actually joins the English court as one of Philippa's ladies in waiting to sort of serve upon the Queen and accompany her to her travels and events that she would have to go to, and just generally look after the Queen. And so that happens in the in the 1360s. And so Alice is at court for quite a few years before Philippa dies. And it seems that at some point after she came to court, probably fairly early on, I think, probably within a year or two of her joining the court, it seems that her and Edward did begin this relationship. But it's really quite difficult to tell because they were very discreet. Edward did still have respect for his wife. And also he had his own image to maintain because he had spent the past 30 years building this idea that he's this great family man, and having this strong marriage. So it wouldn't really be good for his PR to say, oh, actually, yeah, and also I've got a mistress now, especially because quite ironically, when he was younger, his mother had taken a lover and he had very publicly scorned the fact that she had been doing so. So in that respect, he's a little bit hypocritical later on in life. But yeah, it definitely seems that they had this relationship before Philippa died, because they had several children together. And there's records of the children sort of mostly after Philippa has died. But although their ages aren't quite known, it's not quite known their date of birth, particularly with their son. They had a son and two daughters, and there's records of her son in the 1370s away serving in the military. And so for him to be in the position that he was in, he must have at least been about 16 or 17. So when you then sort of backtrack that, it very much puts it into the lifetime of Philippa. So that's kind of the one record that we really have that does show that there must have been something going on whilst Philippa was alive.
Do you think she was aware of it?
Yeah, I think she must have been. Court, although it's filled with hundreds of people and servants and nobles, and particularly at this time, there's various nobles across Europe always visiting. At various points in recent years, Edward had the King of France and the King of Scotland in sort of his possession as prisoners, so all of their nobles come to court. So there's lots of things going on. But Philippa only has a limited number of ladies. Even at the height, she only had a couple of dozen. These women are with her at all times. That's the point of the ladies in waiting, is that they're always there to attend upon the Queen. And, she's had 30 years of her husband's undivided attention up to that point. And so, the idea that he's kind of going to be able to sneak away with one of her ladies without her knowing, I think, is highly unlikely. There's sort of varying views amongst historians. Some have sort of suggested that the relationship might have had her sort of tacit approval, because in the 1360s she was suffering with really poor health for quite a few years before she died. She wasn't able to travel very far. She was really suffering. There's lots of records of her getting medicines. Grants that she gives for several years before she dies have provisions for if she were to die, what would happen with the grant. So it's very clear that they know that she's very sick and that her time is nearing the end. And so, yeah, various historians have sort of said, oh, well, she'd have wanted Edward to be happy. And so, maybe she just turned a blind eye and sort of approved on it, kind of thing. And, obviously all of this is speculation, including my own opinion. But I find that a little bit difficult to believe that, if you've had a marriage for 30 years with someone that you've both been loyal that whole time, you've had a dozen children together, faced all of these various tasks together, the idea that one of your friends is sleeping with your husband, I don't know, personally I don't think that she would have been too keen on it.
I think that's that old-fashioned misogynist attitude, isn't it? The men needed a woman, so he must have taken her as mistress. And of course Philippa knew, as a queen, she knew that her husband the king had needs, so she would have had to, it's like that Henry VIII quote, isn't it? Better women than you have looked the other way, so you're supposed to look the other way. And Philippa knew that because that's how she'd been raised. But it's like you say, there's no evidence, is there, that Edward had any other relationships other than Philippa and Alice?
Yeah, I sort of had a good dig around, but yeah, throughout his lifetime there's no real other suggestions that he had been disloyal, particularly before Alice was on the scene. There's only sort of two veiled sort of references to things. So one of them is a very famous story that Edward III supposedly raped the Countess of Salisbury. But once you sort of dig into the story, and this did circulate during his lifetime, everything kind of really falls apart. I mean, the story appears first in French sources, the French famously being at war with Edward through most of his reign. So it's in their vested interests to portray him as this evil man. And all of the timelines of the story don't add up of when he's supposed to have been there. Even the name of the countess and her age and her husband, none of the facts actually line up with what we know the women in the Salisbury family were at that time. And so it very much does seem to have been a rumour created by the French to sort of besmirch his name. And then the only other reference I could find to another period where Edward might have been unfaithful was in the 1370s, when Alice was at the height of her power. Philippa was already dead. Edward's government's kind of collapsing a little bit. And there's this kind of anonymous poem written by someone, and he mentions about this person at the siege of Calais, which had happened back in the 1340s, that there was a woman at the siege of Calais who had tempted Edward and slept with him. And so obviously that would then possibly be a reference to him being unfaithful earlier on. But again, once you sort of look at the imagery and the lines written in the poem, it actually seems to be more a reference to Alice Perrers, who was the current mistress, because, you know, there's this line where they sort of say, oh, but if I say any more, I'll make a woman very unhappy with me, kind of thing. And, you know, obviously the only woman who was around at that time was Alice. So it seems, again, obviously you can't ever really outright criticize the king at that moment in time. So by sort of having this criticism of Alice placed in a mystery event in the past kind of helps circumvent that a little bit. Those were the only references that I could find, and yeah, as I said, there's no other evidence that he had been unfaithful. I mean, obviously not all records are going to survive, and if one night he had a one-night stand with someone, you know, we're not going to know that, but with the lack of evidence, you know, there's no reason to suppose that he did. So you know, you have to kind of go with that, really.
And the idea of accusing people of having an affair or illegitimate children or whatever, I mean, that was around at the time, wasn't it? Because, I mean, Philippa is always seen as one of the most faithful queens, but there were still rumours of infidelity on her part. Weren't there question marks over John of Gaunt and Edmund of Langley as to whether or not they were Edward III's children?
Yeah, so I'm not too sure with Edmund of Langley, but I know certainly with John of Gaunt there are these rumours later on, sort of as Edward's reign is coming to an end, as he's dying, and Richard II's sort of coming to the throne. And again, it's very much an outcome of the politics of that situation. Where you've got a very old king who's been on the throne for a very long time dying, a child is coming to the throne. It's a very unstable situation. There's going to be a regency, and so it's deciding, well, who's going to be taking control of the country whilst Richard is a child king. And one of the most obvious contenders is his uncle, John of Gaunt. But at this time, he's really not very popular with the common people. I mean, it's only a few years later that you have the Peasants' Revolt and the peasants burn down his palace. So that kind of gives you an idea of what people were thinking about him at that time. And so there's real fear that basically you're going to have the situation that you have 100 years later with the Wars of the Roses, that, you know, maybe John of Gaunt will be encouraged to see off his nephew and then take the throne for himself. Not saying that he did to avoid angering any Ricardians, but you know, that there's this idea, very real fear that, you know, maybe he will just take the throne for himself, and people don't want that. And so there's kind of these ideas of how can we discredit him? How can we make it so that he couldn't take the throne if he wanted? And really the only way to do that would be to show that he was illegitimate and therefore he can't inherit the throne. But quite interestingly, because it is so soon after the death of Philippa, who was such a universally loved monarch, you know, really genuinely everyone seems to have adored her as queen, and was genuinely really upset when she did pass away, that rather than sort of say that she had been unfaithful to Edward, because that would then sort of ruin her own reputation, there's instead this very strange story that she had actually given birth to a daughter, and soon after the birth, an accident had happened, like she'd rolled over the baby in bed or something like that, and the baby had died. And so they didn't want to tell Edward that the baby had died. And so they find a baby in the local town, and the only baby that could be found was a baby boy. And so they take the baby boy and pass him off as the child instead. And that is John of Gaunt. And so therefore, he can't inherit the throne because he's actually just a peasant child from the continent, which, again, obviously just a very scurrilous story. And, you know, there's no way that would have ever happened. But I do think it is very interesting that as desperate as people were to discredit John of Gaunt, they still didn't want to besmirch Philippa's name. And so this kind of idea of like, oh yeah, well, there must have been an accident, and, you know, they just sort of brought in another baby rather than, you know, saying that Philippa had been unfaithful, which, yeah, as I said, I just think it's quite interesting of her legacy in that way, that even then they didn't want to sort of put her in too bad a light.
Yeah, I mean, you said she was sort of universally popular. What do you think made her such a successful queen? Because there doesn't seem to be much doubt that she was one of England's most successful queens. What does she have?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, she had very good upbringing. You know, her mother and father had taught her well, raised her well. Her mother was a very liked countess over in their territories. They had an art filled with sort of culture and books and this idea of learning. So they really had sort of instructed her well, knowing that she was going to end up marrying someone important. I mean, you know, her older sister married the Holy Roman Emperor. So, you know, it's an important family, and they know that they're going to make important marriages. So it's important to therefore teach the daughters how to navigate courts well and how to be seen to be portraying yourself correctly. And I think there's also, she's kind of had quite a leg up in her start in England, shall we say, just because of the political situation in England when she became queen. You know, she's a young teenage girl, probably about 13 or 14 years old. England's kind of on a brink of a civil war, really. You know, the queen's overthrown her husband. A king has died in mysterious circumstances. You've got a new king on the throne. There's people vying at court, different factions, and it's quite a tumultuous time. And Queen Isabella, Edward's mother, who had led this invasion, although she had started off as being very popular, which is how she got support for her invasion, over the few years that she was sort of basically ruling as an informal regency, she really became more and more unpopular just because of the policies she was enacting. You know, she was taking a lot of money and land for herself, and she had this lover that was very unpopular in the kingdom who was acting a bit tyrannical himself. And so that then lends a lot of sympathy to Edward and Philippa, because they're kind of seen as the underdogs. You know, they're meant to be the true king and queen, but they're being held in the dark by this evil mother. And so I think she gains a lot of sympathy early on for that. She's kind of seen as suffering with the kingdom. They then have this very long period of rule together where England is seen to go from strength to strength. You know, although you do have lots of wars going on, and there is various strife that happens, and you have the Black Death hits, and all these terrible things are happening. But through it all, the monarchy is seen as quite strong. And although they're at war, they're winning all these wars. You know, they have captured the French king, they have captured the Scottish king. The country's getting wealthier. You know, as I was sort of saying at the start with Alice's sort of wealth level, you know, this mercantile class is developing. There's more riches coming into England. People are living generally more comfortable lives. And so all of that is then going to reflect well upon the monarchy. And so Philippa's going to absorb a lot of that. But on top of that, I think she just was really good at living up to the feminine ideal of her time. You know, she had lots of children in quite quick succession. You know, they had 12 children together, and 11 of them were had over 18 years. So for those 18 years, she's pretty much constantly pregnant, giving birth, recovering from birth. And so not only is she kind of making the English monarchy stronger by producing all these children, it also then kind of limits her input into politics. So then she's not seen like Isabella was, as being overbearing, interfering in things that she shouldn't. when she does interfere, she's doing it in the proper queenly way. She's interceding on behalf of people. She's getting gifts for servants. She's pardoning criminals, you know, kissing babies, all that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think she's just really good at portraying herself in the correct way. And yeah, I think both the influence from the way she was brought up, plus seeing how Isabella was turned against from her behavior that was seen as perhaps less feminine and less correct, probably really influenced her from an early age. And she just kind of built upon that throughout her life, really.
Is there an element of spin here, in that because she presents as that ideal queen from the point of view of men, particularly, and the church, for example, who, you know, women should be in a particular narrow role. Is there a sense that the chroniclers, those who've written about her during and after her death, they are in a sense rewarding her for being what they expect a queen to be, and she therefore does rather well in terms of history?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, you know, a lot of what we have got about her does come through chronicle accounts. And, you know, when I was looking through all of them, I could not see a single bad word said about her anywhere, which, you know, is quite remarkable. You know, even successful queens tend to at some point, as someone going, oh, she was a bit annoying that she did that kind of thing, you know, especially with all the local politics going on, you know, there's always going to be someone who's taken some land that someone else wanted, and then they go, oh, that's, you know, oh, darn the queen kind of thing. But yeah, there really was very little evidence that I could find of any dislike on her. And perhaps the biggest thing that I could find was that throughout her reign, she did suffer a lot of park breaks, which is basically during this time is when you start to get a lot of enclosure and what used to be public land becoming private land, fenced off for the big landowners. And so locals would show their displeasure with this by breaking into these parks. If they were woods, they would go and hunt game in there, or they would go and steal farm animals and things like that. And so that was the biggest sign I could find of any kind of moves against her. But again, when you put it in the context of the time, it's not like she's the only one experiencing this. You know, all of the major landowners are having it, the king's having it, the princes and princesses are having it, the local earls and dukes are having it. And so it's very much more a symptom of unhappiness with these kinds of policies rather than any sort of perceived direct attack on Philippa. But yeah, as you say, very much the written evidence that survives comes from people like chroniclers who were all always very glowing in their praise of her. And again, as I said, you know, because she rarely interferes in politics, she doesn't come up too much. And when she does come up, it's because she's doing something good. And so that kind of reinforces that. And I think it kind of then obviously reverberates down the centuries. So a lot of the negative reputation of her mother-in-law, of Isabella, that sort of historians perpetuated for a long time, was reading all these chronicles and going, oh yeah, everyone must have hated her because of XYZ. And it's only when you start to dig in and go, well, actually, no, they didn't always hate her. And actually, she was very popular for all of these times. So yeah, there's definitely an element of kind of creating that legacy and building upon it. And when she does die, several chroniclers do create these great eulogies for her and saying how great she is. And she's very much helped in this by the chronicler Froissart, who's one of our main sources for the period. And he worked for her. He was actually her servant. She commissioned him. He would write poems and stories for her, but he also wrote this chronicle by interviewing her and other people at court. And so again, it's very useful for us that one of the main sources for the period is someone who she literally employed. But again, that's then going to create some biases because of course he's not going to say horrible things about her because she's paying him. So yeah, I think it is a very good point about that. And it is interesting sort of wondering what isn't there in the sources, and whether there is anything else. But yeah.
Yeah, because it raises the question, isn't it? Nobody's perfect.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And speaking of not perfect, Alice Perez, on the other hand, is always depicted as a grasping, ruthless woman who's in it for all she can get and actually stole the rings off the king's dead fingers. Is that the woman you found?
Yes, Alice, by contrast, has had a very different portrayal in history. And actually, you know, that's kind of part of why I decided to approach this book as a dual biography. Is I pitched it a bit as the angel and devil on Edward's shoulder, you know, the perfect saintly queen and the evil, horrible mistress. But yeah, just as we were sort of saying about the PR for Philippa filtering through the centuries, I think very much the propaganda against Alice has also filtered through the centuries. And that was certainly one of the most interesting things when researching her, was looking both at what the records do and don't say, to try and fill in a bit more of a rounded picture, because, you know, sometimes you just have to go with feeling. And as we were sort of saying earlier, you know, my feeling that Philippa might not have been happy that Edward had a mistress. My feeling was also, well, if Edward has had this wife for 40 years, who by all accounts he's been completely faithful to until Alice, and then Alice he is completely faithful to until his death, you know, they have a relationship for at least 10 years, if not more, depending on where you place the start of their relationship. And I think I wanted to place a level of trust in Edward's own judgment of people and own judgment of his own relationships, that would he really have been with a horrid woman for a decade who didn't care about him, who was really horrible to everyone around her, really unpleasant, really unattractive, really greedy? That doesn't really add up. You know, there must be a bit more to her. And she is a lot more difficult to trace than Philippa for lots of reasons, not only her class, but because of the nature of their secret relationship whilst Philippa's alive. And then even after Philippa's death, you've then got such a difficult political situation that, as I said, people don't want to write about it because they don't want to attract the wrong attention. You know, there's a reason that even this anonymous poet is sort of saying, oh yeah, no, I shouldn't say anymore because I don't want to upset Alice, you know. So then have those gaps in the chronicles where no one is talking about her because they don't want to sort of draw attention to her or to themselves. So you are really having to piece things together, mostly from official records, which obviously don't really give you an insight into personal relationships. It's all about land and grants and things. But I do think that you can get tastes of their relationship, certainly. And, you know, there's definitely a lot of evidence, I think, on Edward's side of his feelings towards Alice. You know, there's a boat that he names after her, which, you know, all ladies would like to have a boat named after them. You know, there's records of him commissioning jewelry for her with like really sort of quite sweet messages on. You know, he sort of commissioned some brooches for her with words saying never apart on it and things like that. So I think there's definitely lots of evidence on his side that he very much does care for her, and that this isn't just a fling that he's having. And as I said, the length of their relationship kind of testifies to that. But I do think that there's a lot that you can kind of pick up from Alice's side as well. And again, you know, I'd sort of say, giving her the benefit of the doubt, you know, she'd have to have been a really horrible person to have been with him for a decade, had 3 children with him and not like him. You know, I think it's fair to say that even if you do think that she was something of a gold digger, that there must have been at least friendly feelings on her behalf. And I don't think it's too far to say that she cared for him as well. And I think as well, there is evidence that she wasn't as disliked as is thought. I think it's very much a case of histories written by the victors, and because she does ultimately have quite a public downfall and a trial against her, that it's kind of thought, oh, well, everyone must have hated her and that's why, because she was so horrible. But again, when you sort of look at the wider political situation, her downfall comes after Edward dies. You've got this child king coming onto the throne. You've got an unhappy country who is sick of all of these abuses that have been going on at court. And now that they've got a new king, they want to start everything fresh. And there's actually a lot of targeting going on of lots of people at court, not just Alice. And it's very much a read the room situation where you're either with the government and you're going to continue into the new reign, or you're with the people that the government are persecuting, and then you're going to have your own downfall. And so this fact that people did testify against Alice at her trial, I don't think it's straightforward evidence that these people all hated her and they couldn't wait to testify against her, especially because a lot of the people who ended up testifying against her, Alice actually tries to call in her defense. And so these are people that Alice herself believed would come to her defense and were her friends. And in fact, several of them had been her friends for quite a few years, and they had held land on her behalf for her sons, and they'd been involved with business deals with her. So I think that there's a lot more to this story than first seems. And I think as well, one of the key things that I sort of talk about in the book is one of her close friendships is with Bishop Wickham, and he's a very powerful man. He's in the royal household. He's one of the wealthiest clergymen in England, very powerful, and continues to be powerful into Richard II's reign. And even after Alice's downfall, he stays friends with her for the rest of their lives. And this even comes at cost to him. You know, later on in Richard II's reign, they try to implicate him in sort of underhand dealings with Alice as a way to get rid of him. And so it's not in his interests to stay friends with her, and he still does. And so again, I think that kind of gives us hints that there must have been more to Alice than this 2D portrayal of her.
Yeah, and I think, as you said more or less at the start of that, it's the contrast with Philippa in terms of how she is recorded in history, and she's not the ideal woman as far as the chroniclers, a lot of the chroniclers anyway, are concerned. Some are quite vitriolic about her, aren't they? So, and that's there in black and white, as it were, and it stays there, and historians use those sources over the centuries. So yeah, I guess it is, you know, one is cast in one particular way and the other is cast in a different way, and it's difficult now to piece together exactly what Alice did and didn't do, really, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. And it is a really good point. You know, one of the main people whose written records survive that is really horrible towards Alice is Thomas Walsingham's Chronicle. And he is a religious man. Obviously, Alice is an immoral mistress, so that's already a strike against her name. And also during her lifetime, Alice has various land disputes with the Abbey of St. Albans, and he is a priest at the Abbey of St. Albans. So that's the second strike against her name. So yeah, the fact that one of the main sources of these horrible stories come from someone who clearly is not going to like her is a bit of a major flaw, really.
Through centuries, the other woman always gets the blame. It's never the man's fault. It's always the other woman's fault.
But even leaving aside the fact that she's the other woman, in inverted commas, Sharon, you and I have talked about loads of prominent women in the medieval period, and the ones that have had the bad press are the ones who stand up for what's theirs, who go against the flow, who don't accept that men are ruling their lives, really. Or at least if they do, it's very grudging acceptance. And I think Alice fits that mold, really.
Completely. And that is actually another thing that I do sort of argue, particularly when you look at her downfall and her trial. Just as we were sort of saying earlier that Philippa lives up to this feminine ideal, I think there is plenty of evidence when you read between the lines that the main problem with Alice was that she was a woman, and she was a single woman who was not under the control of a man. And when you look at the trial against her, I think it's really quite stark, because the pieces of legislation that come out of this, they're very upset with what Alice has managed to do and how she's managed to play the system. And one of the things that she's accused of doing is she's accused of sitting on the bench of judges at court and sort of influencing cases that happen. And so they pass legislation to stop this happening. But what they say in the legislation is, we are banning all women, and especially Alice Perrers, she has to be specifically named, we're banning all women, especially Alice Perrers, from sitting on the judge's bench. They don't say we're forbidding any person, they say we're forbidding any woman. So they don't care if a man's doing it, they don't care if the men are sitting there and influencing the outcomes to the way that they want. And I think things like that are so vital for showing the problem is that she is a woman and that she is using her sexuality. Again, when you look at the testimony at the trials against her, several of the men mention the fact that as Edward is sort of in his last few months and is quite ill, that Alice is sitting at the head of the bed with him and dictating things. And again, the fact that they're mentioning she's on the bed, you know, it's that reminder that she's sleeping in that bed. And, you know, they sort of say, oh, yeah, well, Edward would say something one day and then the next morning he'd be saying something different. And again, it's that hint that Alice has been in the bed overnight and whispering in his ear. So, you know, although they're not outright saying it, again, it's that hint that actually we don't like it because we want to influence the king. We don't want the woman sleeping with him to influence the king. And yeah, I think it is a really good point that I think that is a lot of the problem that contemporaries had with her.
Yeah. So it's a dual biography. I know that's bound to be tricky from a whole range of reasons. How did you go about it, and what was the most difficult thing you found in doing it?
Yeah, it was a very interesting undertaking, really, because Alice is so much younger than Edward and Philippa. When you sort of look at the time period the book covers, it covers pretty much the entire century. Philippa's born sometime in the 1310s, and Alice dies about 1400, sorry, that would have been really long. So, you know, you're looking at a huge period of time. And although it's a biography of these two women, they're so interlinked with the politics of everything going on that you then are having to track all of that. And, you know, a lot happens in the 14th century. As I said, you've got wars, you've got plague, you've got changes in society. The language in England changes, you know, to English by the end of the century. Everyone at court is starting to talk in English instead of French. So there's so many things that are going on that you're trying to bring in the relevant bits to the story without losing sight of the women. So that's always a bit of a challenge. And particularly for Philippa, I was really keen to keep her at the center of the story because I was very struck when doing my research that sometimes I would read biographies of Edward and I would flick to the index to find the bits about Philippa, and you'd have a 500-page book about Edward and there'd be like 2 entries in the index for Philippa, and it would be her marriage. Oh yeah, she had another baby and now she's dead. And I just sort of go, they were married for 40 years. Like, she was a human woman who was ruling a country. Like, there's got to be more. So for her in particular, I was really keen to keep the story focused on her and the other things that she was doing as well. In terms of like just very technically writing it, the trickiest bit really was approaching that decade or so where Philippa and Alice overlap, because by the nature of their ages, Philippa is the first half of the book and Alice is the second half of the book. So it was trying to tackle how much of Alice to introduce in the Philippa section, because I didn't want to completely ignore her, because as I said, I'm pretty sure that Philippa was aware of Alice's relationship, and so that's then going to be impacting her in the last few years. But when I haven't yet introduced Alice properly, I don't want to be bringing in too much of her and then potentially repeating things later on or confusing people. So that took a lot of editing to figure out just how much to say and not say. And the other section that really took a lot of editing was actually the very start of Alice's section, where I took quite a different approach to how I've written before, just because Alice has been such an enigma for hundreds and hundreds of years. So even at the time that she was at court, no one really knew who she was or where she'd came from. She was very secretive about her past. People didn't know who her family was, where she came from. You know, the chroniclers are all gossiping, saying, oh, I've heard that she was the daughter of a Thatcher, and no, I heard she's the daughter of a Tyler, and oh, I think she was married to this person. No, I think she was. So they don't know at the time who she was. And so that's very much carried on for the centuries after she died, that no one could agree where she came from. There was lots of different theories. One of the theories was that she was the daughter of a knight from Hertfordshire who had the surname Perez, and they sort of said that explains why she's fighting with the Abbey of St Albans, because that's also in Hertfordshire, but no one really knew. And it was literally within the last 2 decades, in the early 2000s, that some petitions were rediscovered at the National Archives that gave some hints to Alice's past. And so these petitions revealed that Perez was actually her married name. Everyone had assumed it was her maiden name, but it was her married name, and her maiden name was Salisbury. So firstly, we found out she'd been married before she came to court. And another petition revealed the name of her brother, a man called John Salisbury. So suddenly these 3 petitions reveal 2 huge pieces of information that for 600, 700 years, Alice had kept hidden. And so I really wanted to bring in all of these debates to the start of her. You know, normally when you're doing a biography, you just sort of say, you know, so-and-so was born on this day and these were their parents. But I thought it was so interesting that Alice was such an enigma that it was literally within the last 15, 20 years that we've actually found out more about who she was. That I wanted to bring in all of those debates and strands and pull it all together. But it just ended up being pages and pages. You know, there's entire articles written about this. And that doesn't really work in a narrative biography like this. So again, there was lots of editing to try and bring those key points across that are very interesting for people to read about without going into every single minute detail of it. So yeah, it was a struggle, but I think it's better for it. I think it is really interesting seeing the 2 of them side by side and comparing that and tracking Edward through them as well, you know, seeing Edward through their eyes as well. I think adds a real different spin on the man himself as well as the women.
I think it works well. As you know, I have read it and reviewed it, and I think it does. It works really well. You do keep Philippa and then Alice at the centre of the story, which is really good, because a lot of the time you get these biographies of women and it's like, okay, where are the women? Oh, there's a little bit of her on this page and then it's about her husband and then another little bit, and they only appear when they have a child.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm glad that comes across.
Definitely. So what are you working on now? Are you writing another book?
Yes, so I actually have my 3rd book coming out later this year. Bit of a sort of different take on my previous ones. So I've sort of always focused on biographies so far, but this is going to be an illustrated history of women in the Middle Ages.
Ooh, can I have a review copy, please?
Can definitely organise that. But yeah, so it's looking at women across Europe from roughly 1000 to 1500 AD, and it's shorter, you know, it's short and sweet, but it's looking at women at all levels of society, from peasants, nuns, professionals as well, looking at artists and writers, up to nobles and queens and rulers. I'm very biased, but it's a beautiful book. It's illustrated with about 200 pictures of art from the time. So
wow.
Manuscript images, paintings, statues, textiles, objects, all sorts of things, and looking at sort of how some of the surviving art can help illuminate some of these lives. You know, we've been talking a lot in this podcast about the written records and the gaps in the written records, and particularly for women who weren't royal and noble and weren't written about, you know, there's a lot that you can find from the art of the period as well. So yes, I'm very much looking forward to that coming out. I've recently had my own sort of proof copies come through, and yeah, the pictures all look lovely.
Did you manage to get all your pictures sourced before the British Library went down then?
No, sadly not, because trying to cross-reference things when you can't actually see them online is really annoying.
Yes.
But no, there's so many great institutions around. You know, we've got the Met and the Rijksmuseum and Getty and all sorts of places. So yes, and yeah, it's been great sort of doing all of that picture research and pulling things in and just seeing things side by side. Yeah, is really great.
Oh, I definitely want to read that. That should be a lovely accompaniment to Heroines of the Medieval World.
Yeah.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, so it's been really fun to write, because it has been a challenge because I've gone outside my comfort zone. You know, I very much specialized in sort of England and France in the late medieval period, and you know, I know bits and pieces about further afield, but having a chance to do all of that research and to really get stuck into some of the other countries in Europe and what was going on, and also to other classes. You know, I've written about nobles and royals, and again, you know, I know bits about sort of nuns and peasants, but not loads. So it's been really interesting to see just how much there is out there about what women in the medieval period were doing, and sort of, again, as we've touched upon in this, that actually seeing how much there was for women to do at that time, you know, this idea that they were just wives and mothers, and actually there was a lot more opportunities open than we first think. So it's been really interesting to see that firsthand.
Well, that's the reinforcing of the women's traditional role, you see, that's been going on for centuries.
Yes.
It's the Victorians again.
Sorry.
Sharon and I
It's
have
those Victorians. I
running
blame the
joke.
They
Victorians.
ruined everything.
We blame them for everything. Yeah. So is there anyone in history that you'd like to write about that you haven't got round to?
I mean, so many, of course. There's always endless ideas. I think sort of coming out from writing this book, from writing The Queen and the Mistress, I'm very much kind of interested in Edward and Philippa's oldest daughter, who was also called Isabella. And I think she's really interesting because she very much breaks, again, our perceived archetype of the medieval princess. And, you know, this idea that medieval princesses were married off as children and went off to foreign lands to have babies and rule countries. And she very much breaks those rules. She doesn't marry until her 30s. She's very much an independent woman who enjoys the fineries of the court. And yeah, I found her really interesting as a kind of side character that kept popping up because she did marry so late. She is constantly there at court, and you know, she turns up alongside Alice as well. You know, after Philippa dies, Alice and Isabella get lumped into a lot of grants from Edward together. Yeah, she's definitely really interesting, and I'd like to learn more about her.
Sounds good. Sounds like a book to me.
Yeah. Hopefully one day.
That's the problem, though, isn't it? As soon as you start writing one book, about 10 ideas for the next one come into your head.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, that was very much the case with this.
Well, thank you very much, Gemma, for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think it's really interesting the way women are perceived as one way or the other, and Philippa of Hainault and Alice Perrers certainly do provide that contrast.
Yeah, definitely. It is really interesting of tracking how they acted and how they were perceived, and how they sort of both approached power in different ways. You know, they both ended up being very powerful women right at the top of the English court, but what they did with that power and how they wielded it was very different.
Well, I can't recommend The Queen and the Mistress highly enough. I thought it was a fascinating read.
That's great.
I couldn't put it down, to be honest. Well done. It's a brilliant book. A worthy sequel to The Royal Witches as well. So thank you very much for joining us, Gemma Holman.
Yes.
It's been absolutely fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. It's been lovely.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you. No, it's been lovely to chat to you both.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Gemma. Do join us next time when we will be talking to Dr. James Wright, when we'll be busting some medieval myths. I've been Sharon Bennett-Connolly.
And I'm Derek Burks. Thanks for listening. And do subscribe to avoid missing a podcast. If you enjoyed it, perhaps give it a like. We'd love to have a rating or a review from you. Join us next time.